So Sunday's newscast dawns with Henry and Laura in different places.
Hello, I am in Salford at our little makeshift studio where we were here this morning broadcasting as the Conservative conference gets underway.
And I am at home in London, but soon to be on my way to Manchester for the Conservative Party conference, like ships in the night with Laura, I guess.
Oh, I'm sad because last week at Liverpool, you'd already made it to Liverpool with the Labour conference. So we were together in our glorious Liverpool studio. So I feel a bit lonely here.
Do you have conference tics? You know, do things you have to do, ties you have to wear, routines you like to do?
Well, I've gone through many years across two employers of having an annual game of mini golf against Matt Chorley, which we already had in Bournemouth at the Liberal Democrat conference, and which I won. Good. For the record. In fact, I won so handily, Paddy, as I'm sure you'd like to know, that I made it onto the top 10 leaderboard of the Bournemouth Smugglers Cove mini golf course of all the people who played in the last week. And I'm not over pleased with that or anything. I just happened to have mentioned that on Newscast.
But it's a Dunhill tournament for you next, mate.
What's the difference between mini golf and crazy golf?
Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe it was crazy golf. It was a little thing made out of plastic by the seaside.
But they're like dinosaurs and pirates or
it was it was pirate themed. There were lots of water hazards.
Crazy golf.
Crazy
golf.
Okay, crazy golf.
I think
sorry.
Mini golf's when you play with a tiny club. I think. Now look,
isn't that pitch and
or a
putt?
toddler?
We're putting that off now. So one day, long in the future, we'll get to grips with the very busy news cycle on this Sunday's edition of Newscast. Hello, it's Paddy in the London studio of Newscast.
And it's Laura in the Salford studio of Newscast.
And it's Henry at home in London.
You've had the Conservative leader on the television, Kemi Badenoch, in a strong sort of outing. She's coming out fighting.
I think no question she was coming out fighting, not least because she has got policies that she and her team have been working on for some months, and now they think it's time to unleash them. She definitely seems to be in the mood where she wants to get stuff out there, and she, in Kemi Badenoch style, is unafraid to talk about things in very blunt language. The other reason I think that she's being so forthright is, frankly, she's under very intense pressure to show that she actually is capable of performing the job that she was elected to do by her party. And the backdrop to this conference, of course, though, not least because it's here in the northwest of England that it's taking place, is, of course, the terrible attack at the synagogue in Heaton Park on Thursday. The Home Secretary, because of that attack, came also to speak to us this morning here in Salford, which is unusual. Normally at a party conference, newscasters might think, well, why are there, normally you just have the big politician from the main party. But Shabana Mahmood has been here in Manchester for the last few days. And we began our programme today with her just giving us the very latest on the investigation. There's still 4 people in custody. The investigation, she said, is happening at pace. But there is nothing more in the public domain and nothing more from the Home Secretary about what we know about the attacker. She said, though, she was very worried about community relations. And she's come forward a few days after the attack with what she wants to do, which is give police more powers to curb repeated protests. So the kinds of protests that we've seen weekend after weekend after weekend in support of Gazans, the Home Secretary wants to give the police more power to curb those. And I think that's going to be very controversial, and there's going to be a very vigorous debate about it in the weeks to come.
Let's listen to the Home Secretary talking this morning.
I'm specifically going to amend parts of the Public Order Act that will enable the police to place greater restrictions and conditions on protests based explicitly on what we call cumulative disruption. That is to say, regular protests by often the same group of people, often in the same place. So I want to make explicit in the law that those types of protests with cumulative disruption for communities can attract the same conditions and restrictions that apply to other types of protests, so that the police have absolute clarity that they can use cumulative disruption as a reason for restricting those protests.
And if we just cut through the jargon there, when she means cumulative protests, what I tried to get from her, which she sort of said yes, is what that means is those protests, maybe they're on Whitehall, maybe they're in Trafalgar Square, maybe they're outside Manchester Cathedral, those places where week after week after week there have been demonstrations in support of Palestinians that many politicians believe have been exploited by people who want to come out and express anti-Semitism and hatred towards Jewish people. Those are the protests that are in her sights. That's what this is about.
And also, Henry, we've seen the Greens warn that this is a slip to authoritarianism. So we can see on the left this is a political fault line. But does it show us the sort of muscular side of Shabana Mahmood that we were told to expect in her new role, this type of tough talking?
Yeah, unquestionably. And I think it also shows the speed with which she makes decisions, which, fairly or otherwise, was something that Yvette Cooper, her predecessor, was repeatedly criticised by her colleagues privately for. And here is Shabana Mahmood, just a few days after what happened in Manchester, making this announcement. But I think there's all sorts of political difficulty here for the government to come. I mean, first, Paddy, as you say, there is the question of whether this is overly authoritarian, which I think is a debate that will primarily, though not exclusively, play out on the left, given that Kemi Badenoch has supported what the government is doing here. Then there's the question of what it means to constrain these protests. The government is not saying they want to stop these protests from happening. They are saying they might put extra restrictions on how long they can take place for or where they can take place. But I think the government implicitly is doing this because they are now acknowledging what a lot of British Jews and others have been saying for 2 years, which is that these marches are threatening to them. I mean, that's essentially what Shabana Mahmood is saying. Now, if you now accept that as the government, is it adequate to what you are accepting to then say, well, they'll go ahead, but they'll finish an hour earlier, or they'll take place in a different part of a certain city? I think it is, perhaps the downside of speed is that there are some questions here which I think the government is going to actually have to come up with clear answers to in the coming days. And perhaps most immediately, by the way, there's a big protest, as there often is, taking place in London next Saturday, in central London. Is that going to happen? I assume it will, because Parliament won't have sat by then, and presumably there has to be some parliamentary element to these changes. But if it does take place, though we've had the Home Secretary on Laura's programme this morning essentially saying that protests like that ought to be restricted, well, that does start to look like sort of a problem for the government.
I think it is likely to be problematic in its practice. And I think it's also problematic politically because Kemi Badenoch said, I will support it. But frankly, what took them so long? It's problematic in that sense that why did it take this attack for the government actually to decide that now is the time to restrict these protests when people have been warning about it for a long time? There's also going to be an almighty political row. And as you were alluding to, Paddy, the Greens are already out there. In the United Kingdom, the right to protest is a fundamental principle. And even though there's an argument here articulated by the Home Secretary this morning, supported by Kemi Badenoch and supported by lots of other people, there will also be people, we've already heard from the Greens. It'll be interesting to see what the Lib Dems will do about this, because a Liberal Party is a Liberal Party and believes in liberal values. What will all Conservatives say about this? Because freedom of speech and freedom of protest is important too. So there's a political risk on one side in terms of pace and what took you so long, and a political risk on the other side saying this is not a kind of British thing to do, to tell people that they're not allowed to go out on a particular street at a particular time to carry out a particular protest. That said, clearly the new Home Secretary, and you assume the Prime Minister, have concluded actually they had to act here. And they couldn't come out for another few days saying, oh, well, we asked people to stay at home and they didn't stay at home, but we have to have a bit more of a think or a review or an inquiry or, oh, it's all up to the police. And I think, Henry, you're right. One of these things is interesting about this move is it's a sign from Shabana Mahmood that she is, I think she'd describe herself as a woman in a hurry. She wasn't going to hang back. And if the solution's not perfect, I think her view would be it's better to do something, even if it's maybe a bit rough around the edges, than do nothing at all.
I think that's right. I mean, in terms of the political debate around this, I do think one of the many lessons we can take from the COVID era is that for all that we like to talk about, and Boris Johnson used to like to talk, among others, about Brits being a freedom-loving nation, etc., Brits are pretty authoritarian, actually. I mean, there were no COVID restrictions that weren't, at least at the time, in polling, very popular. A lot of people wanted various restrictions to be broader, deeper, and last for longer. So, do I think there is going to end up being a groundswell of public opinion defending the right to protest? No. However, do I think there are particular political sensitivities in a Labour Party which is trying to not bleed more votes to the left on this? Yes.
Right, because there's a couple of things I'd add. I'm just looking down. Cumulative disruption is a new phrase on me, cumulative disruption. So it's, if you have a regular protest in a regular place about the same issue, that's what cumulative disruption is being defined as. So that's going to annoy people like Zach Polanski, the new leader of the Greens. So there'll be a fault line there. But yesterday, Laura spoke to Kemi Badenoch at the site of this horrific terror attack on British Jews. And she accused the government in the interview with Laura of being backwards in coming forwards. So the question, I suppose, is Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the opposition, supporting Labour's new Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, in her new crackdown on cumulative disruption?
So she told me, yes, the Conservatives would back the proposals, and then immediately moved into her very strong belief that the government has been too slow to act in this area. But she, absolutely explicitly said that they would back the proposals in Parliament, because there does have to be an amendment to the Public Order Act in order to make these changes. We should also say, ultimately, the decision about when and where to use these new powers will still come down to individual police forces. So this is the Home Secretary giving police new tools to manage these protests, or, disrupt the protests that have become, in many people's view, unwieldy and dangerous and wrong. In other people's view, very important occasions where people are expressing themselves. But ultimately, this is about giving the police a new tool to act. But the Home Secretary has made it very, very clear what she wants to happen.
I think that, by the way, is one place this debate is going to go before long. As you rightly say, Laura, this is about the government giving new powers to the police. And we've had 2 years of this sort of slightly awkward thing where at certain points the government will say, we'd like the police to do this. And then the police will say, well, we'd like the government to give us more powers to do that. And this question of operational independence for the police, and where it begins and where it ends, and where it means that actually public accountability is being eluded, I think is really interesting. There's a really interesting piece by Tom Tugendhat, who was a Conservative Home Office minister until the general election in the Jewish News this morning, essentially saying that operational independence has become a cloak for both sides to hide behind so that they don't make the difficult decisions. And I think, if Shabana Mahmood is truly going to make difficult decisions, then I think this is something that she will end up having to consider before long. Because let's remember, by the way, Keir Starmer, not just Shabana Mahmood, but Keir Starmer, with the office and authority of the Prime Minister, pleaded with people essentially, not to take part in protests yesterday, and they ignored him en masse. And that's pretty humiliating for the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister does actually have powers at his disposal beyond pleading with people in public. And I wonder whether, he will come under greater pressure to use them.
Let's listen to what Kemi Badenoch said.
What happened in Manchester was completely foreseeable. Not enough has been done. Jewish people have been very worried about their safety. I want them to know that we believe that they should be in this country. We do not want to see them leaving. Many of them told me that they're already leaving. Family members are leaving. They feel safer in Israel, a war zone, than they do in our country. How has it come to that? We have always provided sanctuary to Jews, and we always should.
There are two enormous news events happening this weekend. And there's the reaction at home to the terror attack on British Jews. And then there's the international reaction to the prospect of peace as a result of the 20-point White House plan, which was then picked up in a yes, but response by Hamas. So there's an awful lot happening with the international reaction to the aspect of the first time we've heard hope used. But it seems to me that hope meets fear this weekend. It's not clear what the next few days will bring, but the Israeli Prime Minister addressed Israelis on the television last night to say he thinks the hostages will be released within days. And then there are peace talks due to begin in Egypt on Monday.
And at the heart of this, of course, Paddy, is the hostage families, the people whose family members were taken from them, many of them whom died or were killed, and some of them whom are still waiting. And there are some of those families, not just in Israel, but also who have relatives here in the UK. And I think you spoke to one of them this morning.
Yes. So this morning we spoke to Médecins Sans Frontières, the charity working in Gaza. I spoke to their coordinator who's in Gaza this morning about the prospect of aid trucks at the border being allowed this week to come in en masse. A hope, he says, but we prepare for the worst. That's what the war has taught us, he said. And Sharon Lifshitz, both of whose parents were taken on October the 7th from the kibbutz where she herself grew up. Her mum was released, famously grasping the hand of one of the captors, saying shalom to him. And her dad was held and we now know died, was killed very shortly after his abduction. So she says as well, this is the biggest moment since then. I wonder what happens to protest in Britain if peace begins to happen in the Egypt peace talks. It seems to me the reason why people are coming out is to protest about the proscription of the Palestine Action Group. And then there are other people who were coming out on the street to ask for the release of hostages. And then there were other people who were coming out on the street to ask for an end to the war, accusing Israel of genocide. But if you get moved towards peace, does that necessarily, Henry, do you think, calm down the British street?
Well, who knows? I mean, it's what a lot of people will be hoping for. You'd assume so, given that the tagline for these protests for the best part of 2 years has been "Stop bombing Gaza." So if that stops, you'd assume the protests would stop, at least in large part. But let's see. I mean, this is one of the things that is in question, right? I mean, many of the British Jews that Laura, for example, spoke to over the last few days would say that their deep fear is that actually for a portion, perhaps a small portion of those protesters, it's not really about what's happening in the Middle East, and that's a pretext, and therefore their hostility expressed on the street will continue. And let's see. I mean, I think it is one irony worth noting, given how this conflict has shaken up our politics and questions of community relations, as Shabana Mahmood said this morning, that the UK is absolutely peripheral. In fact, peripheral is to understate it, is not involved in what is happening over the next few days. If there's peace or not, the UK is completely irrelevant to it. And that is, I think, something just worth reflecting on, given how turbulent this has made our country.
It's interesting because it's become incredibly relevant to our politics, even though we are not involved directly in the politics of what has gone on, in a way that actually in a different era, with a different prime minister or a different government or a different international context, you can imagine actually that a British prime minister or a British foreign secretary may have been deeply involved. And of course, you know, there's one T. Blair who appears to be deeply involved in all of this. So it's very interesting. Perhaps did we imagine at the beginning of that conflict and the terrible events of October the 7th, did we imagine then the impact this would have from thousands of miles away in terms of what happens, not just on our streets, but also in our elections, in our politics, in these conversations that have come to pass? I don't think so.
So you mentioned T. Blair, who I think will be frequently addressed on newscasts to come. I take your Tony Blair and I raise you a Margaret Thatcher. Born, says my Sunday Times, 100 years ago, and asks the question, has the Conservative Party ever learnt to shake off Margaret Thatcher? And as their conference begins, one of the papers asks, do they need to find a new Thatcher or shake off Thatcher? So that's a way, I think, to get to the Tory party conference.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? So backers of Kemi Badenoch, who are still a crowd, although probably not as enthusiastic a crowd as they were some time ago, on lots of different occasions, some of them said things to me like, she does have something of the strength and character that Margaret had. Her first few years were very shaky. She had to learn. And then after a few years in the job, she developed then into the strong leader that she became and won incredible election victory after election victory. But they made another point, which I think is funny, that piece is even in the paper today, marking that occasion. Because someone said to me, and I can't remember if we talked about this yesterday, that the Tories have a messiah complex. Basically, they're obsessed with their leader and this idea that the leader is always going to emerge, who will come and lead them to glory. And actually, it's about all of them, and it's about MPs and about councillors and about the context and about their ideas and their plans and their policies. It's not just about that one leader. But the Tory party does always think very much about its leader. Kemi Badenoch has been under massive pressure, and she is trying to recapture that today by her big borders plan, with a promise to deport 150,000 people a year who don't have a right to be here in the UK. And she talked about it at some length this morning, and she didn't particularly, I think, want to dwell too much on where those 150,000 people, the population of a city like Cambridge or a place like Blackpool, where they would actually go, and whether her policies were actually completely credible in the way that she claims they are.
I'm tired of us asking all of these irrelevant questions about where should they go. They will go back to where they should do or another country, but they should not be here. We need to look after the people in our country.
But it's
It
not
is not
irrelevant
fair.
to say where would they go.
It
That's
is-
a fundamentally
it is not. It is
question.
the most relevant question is should they be here? If they should not be here, then they need to be removed.
I think what's interesting in that section of your interview, Laura, is that Kemi Badenoch, over the course of the interview, and I'm told over the course of this conference, is going to try and differentiate herself from Reform UK, but also Labour and other parties by saying, well, look, they have slogans, but I have a plan. But Kemi Badenoch, repeatedly asked by you where these people would be deported to, essentially said, well, that doesn't matter. That's not the important question. The important question is, should they be here? Which is, works as a political approach and a political slogan for sure, and is the question that many of her voters or the voters the Conservatives had lost would like her to be asking. But it does run into difficulty when essentially your big differentiation point that you're trying to articulate is that you've thought through every detail of every aspect of your plan.
It would be hard these days to find somebody in either the Conservatives or the Labour Party who would say that people who don't have a legal right to be in the UK ought not to be persuaded or ought not to be living somewhere else. I think that is now a sort of consistent position in the two traditionally big parties. But it is highly relevant if you're standing to become Prime Minister to explain to people how you would actually make that happen.
Yeah.
And it was quite interesting because she was sort of, she's trying to present herself, Henry, as you said, that all this stuff is really carefully worked out. But when challenged, she basically said, well, I don't really care about that. I'm just telling people what I want to happen. And she's trying to pitch herself as a serious, considered politician, unlike Reform, who the Conservatives have been accusing of shooting from the hip, just saying whatever suits them in the moment and not having the detail. And they might rub up against that problem today. Not least also, though, I think there'll have been people listening this morning who will have heard that in a way that felt, hang on a minute, I don't really like much the sound of that tone. It's very strident. It makes me feel a bit uncomfortable. But she's definitely pushing into that Reform end of the Conservative Party, tilting towards the right on this particular policy area. She'd, of course, dispute that she's tilting towards Reform, and she would say that Reform have been a sort of pastiche in trying to copy what traditional conservatism is meant to be, and it's not. But I think that is where she's positioning herself.
I think it underscores that in the 11 months or 10 months that Kemi Badenoch has been Conservative Party leader, the question has changed. Originally, the question was, how do you, after a brutal defeat, rebuild bit by bit and be in a position to take on the Labour government at the next general election in 4 or 5 years' time? What has happened since she became leader means that the question is now, can the Conservative Party regain some of those voters that it has lost to Reform in the polls and in the case of local elections in actuality? And that, I think, is what is pushing the Conservative Party in perhaps a more strident, as you put it, direction on this issue and others, Laura, is because actually the existential question for the Conservative Party demands that they find a way to get back these voters from Reform. And it's only then that they might be able to think about the other bit of their coalition and the votes that they lost to the Liberal Democrats at the general election and all of that. Those would be luxuries for the Conservative Party to be able to address, because right now they're just having massive bites of their coalition taken out of them by Reform.
That's right, but there are other people in the party, and we talked about it a bit yesterday, so I won't bore you all with that again, but there are other people in the Conservative Party who say that's not where the gap in the market is. Don't try to outform Reform. If you want a full fat Coke, you're going to buy a full fat Coke, was how somebody expressed it to me, with which I think, Paddy, I bored you with that yesterday already.
No, I like both. I like the analogy and a full fat drink. So time for us all to go silent. It's been a long time since anyone said that, except Bernadette is a newscaster in Glasgow. Is it just me that feels like the government and the Tories are moving more to the right? The Labour government and the Conservatives are reacting to Reform and their language is getting stronger. Is this just a temporary move, or should we get used to this, says Bernadette?
I think we should get used to this for a while, as some of the issues and problems that the country faces and concerns, particularly around immigration, has seen politicians responding to that, not just because of Nigel Farage, but also because of the context of what has happened in terms of asylum hotels in many towns and small boat arrivals.
Okay, so yesterday I raised, at the start of our meeting today, I raised a question of conference rituals, and we are going to go out talking about karaoke because that's apparently something that Laura loves to do. Is that right?
No, I said I'd never did it at
Oh,
conference,
you never did.
but it is a rich part of the political party conference traditions. But no, in the era of camera phones, I have never been daft enough to go and sing something at karaoke in front of the rest of Her Majesty's assembled press.
So we can look at the track list of Taylor Swift's album, The Life of a Showgirl, to see if Kemi doesn't like I Will Survive, which Tim Shipman got that out of her in the week gone by. Would she like any of the track list of the new Taylor Swift album?
That is a question to which I don't know. Henry, anything on the list that you think that Kemi Badenoch might like?
Can I just say,
wish
I think
list.
for some reason, maybe this is like a full sense of deja vu, but I think in my 2 years at the BBC, I've been asked to relate Taylor Swift to political figures like a good dozen times, which, I don't know, probably says more about Taylor Swift than it does anything else. Well, I mean, just looking at the track listing here, I haven't listened to the new album yet. Maybe I'll listen to it on the train up to Manchester. But looking at the track listing that has been helpfully supplied here, it does appear to me that cancelled, all caps, exclamation mark, may well be the new track on Taylor Swift's album, which may well be Kemi Badenoch's fate at some point in the next year.
If you've got suggestions of your own, you can be sure Adam will know all of Taylor Swift's tracks for when he picks up on Monday. So let's hope that we can hear more about where the music will take us. But for now, it looks like very much like the end. Have a lovely conference, you two.
Thank you
Thanks,
very
Paddy.
much, Paddy.
And it's goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.